All right, so welcome to the deep dive. You guys sent in some really interesting stuff from the Inner Balance Red Print podcast, and we're going to take a deep dive into a really intriguing idea. They say there's one single choice, just one, that has the power to completely change everything in your life.
Yeah, I think what really jumps out from this podcast right off the bat is this concept of like pivotal choices, right? Like we make so many decisions every day, but there are these like rare moments where we make a decision that totally shifts our trajectory. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. The podcast really highlights that contrast, like we're
Yeah.
constantly deciding small things, like should I take the highway or back roads to work? But then there are these like less frequent but way more impactful decisions that really set the course for like our whole lives. The examples in the podcast are actually really fascinating.
Yeah, they talked about Steve Jobs dropping out of college and Oprah Winfrey leaving, like a toxic work environment, right?
Huh.
These weren't just, everyday decisions. These were like deliberate breaks from the path they were on, driven by like a really strong sense of self and a willingness to just kind of jump into the unknown.
And the podcast like really emphasizes that it's not about luck or like some special talent. It's about the power of intentionally making a choice to step onto a different path.
Right. It completely shifts the focus from what's happening around you to your own ability to take action.
Yeah.
So knowing how much emphasis they put on this one powerful choice, what exactly does this podcast say is the life-altering choice?
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. They say that the one choice that can change everything is this: choose to take full responsibility for your life.
Now, they actually point this out in the podcast. That might sound pretty simple, maybe even a little obvious, right? You're probably thinking, well, yeah, of course, I'm responsible for my life.
Yeah.
But the podcast really digs into what that actually means. Like, what does that actually look like?
Exactly. They talk about how, a lot of times we're kind of operating on autopilot.
Mm.
And when things go wrong, we tend to look for reasons outside of ourselves. We blame our circumstances, our past, other people, like whatever we can point to. But like this one choice, it flips that whole script. It's about deciding very consciously to own everything,
Mm.
your actions, your thoughts, and ultimately where you end up in life.
And what's really cool is that they don't frame it as like passively accepting responsibility. It's more like this active commitment. Is that moment when you stop seeing yourself as just a product of everything that's happened to you and start recognizing that you actually have the power to shape your reality.
Yeah, and the podcast really gets into the specifics of like what this looks like in a practical sense. It's about letting go of this idea that you have to wait for the perfect time or for someone to give you permission. It's about understanding that where you are right now is a result of the choices you've made. And most importantly, that where you go next is entirely up to you.
Right. That's a fundamental shift in perspective.
Yeah.
The difference between feeling like you're just drifting along and actually taking the wheel and steering your own ship.
Yeah.
Okay, so taking full responsibility, like that sounds powerful in theory, but how does the podcast actually recommend putting this into practice in everyday life?
Yeah, they get into that, which I think is super helpful. It's not just like, okay, I'm in charge now. They give some really concrete steps. The first one is about shifting from a victim mindset to what they call a creator mindset. It's about moving away from this happened to me and towards, okay, how can I learn from this and grow from this?
And that reframing, that's so important because it takes back your power. Instead of feeling powerless, like things are just happening to you, you start to see that you can actually learn and grow from any situation. And, it's not just about like thinking positive thoughts. It's about understanding that you can develop your abilities and your intelligence through effort and hard work.
Totally. And then the next step they talk about is eliminating excuses. Basically, you have to be able to identify when you're making excuses, like those stories we tell ourselves about why we can't do something, and then consciously replace those excuses with like concrete action steps.
Yeah, that's where things get real. Excuses can be so sneaky because they often sound really reasonable.
Yeah.
But they're usually just masking our fear or lack of confidence. So being able to call out those excuses and focus on what you can actually do, even if it's just a small step, that's a real sign that you're taking ownership.
And then they talk about this idea of like adopting a growth mindset, right? It's this idea that failure isn't the end of the world. It's actually valuable feedback. Setbacks become opportunities to come back stronger.
I love that. Seeing failure as a learning opportunity is so crucial because it lets you reframe mistakes as just part of the process instead of like these huge judgments. And that's so important for taking risks and pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone, which are both essential for, taking full responsibility.
Definitely. And the podcast also emphasizes taking action every day. It doesn't have to be like these huge leaps. Even small, consistent steps over time, they really add up. It's all about overcoming that feeling of being stuck and starting where you are with what you have.
Yeah, consistency is key. Those small, deliberate actions, they build momentum, and they reinforce this feeling of control. It's a great way to fight that feeling of being overwhelmed by big goals.
Oh, and one more thing they touch on is the importance of your environment, specifically the people you surround yourself with. They encourage listeners to seek out relationships that are like challenging, inspiring, and supportive of your growth.
Yeah, because the people we spend time with, they have a huge impact on our choices and what we believe is possible.
Huh.
Surrounding yourself with people who embody that sense of responsibility and who are also striving for growth, that can be incredibly motivating and supportive.
So basically, when you put all of these pieces together, taking full responsibility, it's not just some passive idea, it's about actively changing how you think, letting go of excuses, learning from your challenges, taking consistent action, and being mindful of who you spend your time with. According to this podcast, the ultimate result of all of this is that you regain control of your life, and you shift from just reacting to things to actively building the life you want.
Yeah, it's like going from being a passenger in your own life to being the driver. And to really illustrate this, the podcast suggests sharing like a real world example of someone who embraced this choice and actually saw real change.
Okay, so let's imagine a guy named Mark. Mark's career just felt stagnant. He was in a job he didn't enjoy, felt passed over for promotions, and he was constantly complaining to his partner about how unfair his boss was and how there were no good opportunities. He was always blaming something outside of himself, the company, the job market, his lack of connections. But then, after talking with a mentor one day, something clicked. He realized he was always pointing the finger outwards, so he decided to take responsibility for his career. He stopped complaining and started figuring out like what skills were in high demand in his industry. He carved out time each week to take online courses, and he started going to industry events to network, even though it felt really awkward at first.
That must have been tough.
Yeah, but even though there were definitely moments of doubt and frustration because he had made that fundamental shift to owning his situation, he was able to see those setbacks as like learning experiences and opportunities to adjust his approach. So within a year and a half, he landed a new job that was not only more aligned with his interests, but it also offered him way more room for growth. And while his colleagues were like super impressed by his transformation, Mark knew that it all started with that one decision to take responsibility for his career.
That's a great example of how a choice that seems so simple can actually lead to really concrete and significant results. It really highlights that taking responsibility isn't about beating yourself up for the past. It's about empowering yourself to create a better future.
Exactly. The podcast really stresses that this isn't just some theory. It's a real and effective path to like real personal change. And now we want to challenge you, our listener, with that same question.
Yeah, taking what we've learned from the Inner Balance Red Print podcast, we want to ask you, are you ready to choose responsibility? Are you ready to truly own your decisions, your failures, and most importantly, your successes?
The podcast makes this bold claim that by choosing to take full responsibility, you can unlock possibilities that you haven't even thought of. You can actually create the life you want instead of waiting for it to happen.
So, as you go about your day, we want to leave you with this question. What is one area of your life where taking complete responsibility could create the biggest positive change for you right now? And even more importantly, what's one small step you can take today to start making that shift? A powerful question to really sit with and explore.